Welcome to the CAS-E podcast, The Resilience of Magic in Modernity, Part 1. Welcome to the second podcast of the Center for Advanced Studies in the Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg, acronymed as CAS-E. The center is called Alternative Rationalities and Esoteric Practices from a Global Perspective, and one of its core research objectives is to explore the apparent resilience of esoteric practices from a global perspective, despite the proliferation and discursive power of technological and scientific rationalities. CAS-E is since 2022 generously funded by the German Research Foundation, the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, and if you are interested in our work, you can find more information on our website. My name is Bernd-Christian Otto. I'm a scholar of religion and one of the founding members of this center. Today we have as invited guests Andrea Centore, one of the co-founders of the Research Network for the Study of Esoteric Practices, Professor Judith Noble from University Plymouth in the UK, and Professor Pasi from the Center for the History of Hermetic Philosophy and Related Currents at the University of Amsterdam. The topic of today's podcast is the resilience of magic in modernity. In contrast to the last podcast, which began with a brief definition of astrology, we will take a more practice-oriented approach. I will ask each of our invited guests to begin with a brief example of what a magical practice can look like today. And we begin with Professor Judith Noble. She is Professor of Film and the Occult at University Plymouth and an artist for whom the practice of magic is central. She began her career as an artist filmmaker, exhibiting work internationally, for instance through Water into Wine, 1980, and she worked for over 20 years in the film industry before returning to academic research and art practice around 2006. Her current research centers on surrealism, the occult, and work by women artists, and she has published on filmmakers including Derek Jarman and Kenneth Anger. Her continuing practice as an artist includes texts, images, and mixed media pieces created through trance work, spirit possession, and interaction with the more than human. Her most recent film is Fire Spells from 2022, a collaboration with director Tom Chick. Judith Noble is an acclaimed artist, a scholar in the area of film and art history, and a long-standing magical practitioner, all at the same time, a hybrid species today also known as practitioner-scholar. Judith, welcome to Erlangen. Which example would you like to present?
Thank you, Bernd. I'm going to talk about a contemporary witchcraft ritual, the purpose of which is self-transformation, self-growth. Okay. 7 witches stand on a vast empty beach on Ynys Môn, Anglesey, off the coast of North Wales, on a still, clear night, and the tide is rising. The full moon has risen over the mountains of Llŷn in the east and is making a fiery pathway over the sea. Nothing is said. The ritual is silent. The witches cast a circle round themselves. Each holds a small mirror. Slowly and deliberately, each catches the light of the moon in their mirror and reflects it onto their body, from their head down to their feet. As the tide peaks, they stand in a circle. The first witch takes her mirror and catches the moonlight in it. She reflects the light onto the next witch, who catches it in their mirror. Slowly, silently, and with great magical concentration, the moonlight is passed around the circle until it is returned to the first witch. The ritual is done. They shout in triumph. They have become the moon. They have become the cycle and the circle of the moon and the tides, taken it into themselves. And they have become one thing with it. For each, it brings a new sensibility, a profound harmony with the moon goddess and the lunar and tidal rhythms, expressed not just in dreams, visions and creative work, but in their everyday lives too over the succeeding months. That's my example.
Thank you very much. Very impressive. So we will just move on to the second speaker, second invited guest. who is Marco Pasi. Marco is the director of the Center for the History of Hermetic Philosophy and Related Currents at the University of Amsterdam. He has published extensively on the history of modern Western esotericism, especially in relation to magic, art, and politics. For instance, he's the author of Aleister Crowley and the Temptation of Politics, published in 2014. Marco Pasi has been a Francis Yates Fellow at the Warburg Institute in London and a research fellow at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies and at the Max Weber Center at the University of Erfurt in Germany. He has been a member of the research network Enchanted Modernities, funded by the Leverhulme Trust, focusing on the influence of theosophy and related movements on visual, musical, performing, and applied arts. He is also the chief editor of the Arius book series, published by Brill. Marco, it's great to have you here in Erlangen. Welcome. Which practice would you like to present as an example?
Thank you very much, Bernd. I wanted to bring an example which is more historical, perhaps, but it is an example that still applies today because I'm going to talk briefly about a practice that is still very much present with contemporary practitioners. And I would like to refer to the Book of the Sacred Magic of Abraham Mellin. This is a magical handbook that has its origins in the early modern period, but which was rediscovered at the end of the 19th century in the context of an occultist organization called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. So this is probably the most famous modern occultist group. And in that context, the very founder and head of this group discovered a manuscript in a library in Paris and decided to publish it. So this was actually the very first publication in a modern language. And in the book, you have a description of a very, very complicated ritual that is supposed to take a number of months. Other versions of this manuscript have been then discovered, and in fact, the period can change. So it can go from 3 months up to 18 months. So it's a very long period indeed. And basically, the practitioner is supposed to create a sacred space, like a temple, and to perform a series of rituals in that place. The place has to be removed from busy situations, busy contexts, so away from big cities. For instance, in the countryside, the idea was even to do it close to a lake. Well, we know that at least one of the occultists who was involved in the Golden Dawn tried to perform this ritual. His name is Aleister Crowley and is one of the most famous occultists of the 20th century. And basically, the ritual consisted of a series of practices that were supposed to happen in that sacred space, a temple. And the goal of this ritual was to create a connection with what is called the Holy Guardian Angel. So an entity that is supposed to be close to you and to guide you, to protect you, to support you in different moments of your life. So that's supposed to be the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel. So that's the ultimate goal of the ritual. And at the end of this, so you have like a mystical experience. It's like a form of illumination when you achieve this special contact with this entity. But this also gives you all sorts of powers. For instance, the ability to walk underwater for a long period of time, or also to find treasures, so to find money. So very, very material aspects of life. And we know that Aleister Crowley performed this ritual, but he never came to the end of it. So he didn't finish it at the beginning because he was involved in all sorts of stories in this occultist organization, so he had to stop. But we know that this has become a sort of tradition in occultism, so this has been practiced by many other occultists since. And it is still practiced today. So, in fact, we have several accounts of persons practicing this ritual, and in some cases claiming also that they were able to get to the end of it, so achieving this famous knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel. And that was my example.
So we will move on to the third person, which is in this case me. So I will also present an example as the third speaker in today's podcast. So I will also say a few sentences about myself first. Unsurprisingly, I've also worked on magic over the course of my career from different angles. That's why I have chosen the topic and invited you all in the first place. Some of my books, I will just mention Defining Magic, a Reader, published 2013 with Routledge, or Fictional Practice, Magic, Narration, and the Power of Imagination, published in the Aries book series at Brill in 2021. But enough about myself. The example I would like to present is based on my own fieldwork in a new religious movement called Sweet Medicine Sundance Path, which also goes by the name Deer Tribe Métis Medicine Society. The movement is not well known, so there is hardly any academic scholarship done on that particular group. It operates for the most part in the US, especially in Arizona, and in various European countries, including Germany. So there is a local German tribe of several hundred practitioners, and I have done fieldwork in this group between 2019 and 2023. In total, this group might have a few thousand active practitioners worldwide. Now, the movement was founded in the mid-1970s by a man named Harley Swifty Reagan, who died in 2013. And he claims to teach traditional ceremonies derived from the esoteric branches of the religions of the Navajo, Sioux, Hopi, and other Native American tribes. So it's a Neo-Amerindian movement, if you like. It is very complex and multifaceted. It is an initiatory movement, and the teachings, so-called teachings, are passed on through oral training, mostly oral encounters, so they have hardly published anything. All you learn is through oral encounters with so-called sacred pipe carriers, teachers who have often undergone decades of intensive training. And these practices, they are revealed through an initiatory path with in total 21 so-called gateways. So they are only gradually revealed over the course of many years. So I didn't see everything in those 4 years, but quite a bit. I'd like to briefly portray the main elements of one particular and quite impressive wish fulfillment ceremony that I did in this movement in August 2021 as a practitioner observer while doing my fieldwork there. It was in the Black Forest. So for that ceremony, I needed to find and cut a living stick from one of the surrounding trees at this ceremonial site in the Black Forest. I would utter my prayer, so my concrete wish, which I had at that time, into the stick, which would then carry the prayer, so to speak, and also garnish the stick according to the wish. My daughter was also there, and she also added a wish to the stick. After the stick was properly prepared, all people who participated in the ceremony, we were roughly 20 practitioners. We built a huge altar made from natural ingredients from the surroundings, like trees, stones, plants, flowers, and other elements. And in the afternoon, the actual ceremony took place. It took around an hour, and each participant would follow a certain route around the altar, which involved various prayers and offerings, especially to Wakantanka, who is a name for the so-called Great Spirit in this movement. And while doing that, the prayer sticks or the wish sticks, they are actually burnt so that the embedded wish is transformed into fog or air, and and it goes up to the Great Spirit. I remember that in the culmination of the ritual, I kneeled before the altar and I actually negotiated with Wakantanka whether my wish was justified and whether it may or may not be granted. This is one of the elements in this movement. It's not just plain wish fulfillment, so there is a communication partner with whom you discuss everything, which is the Great Spirit. And it was quite an impressive moment. And I also remember it felt real, and I remember that I started crying because it felt so intense. From a practitioner perspective, because I'm also a practitioner-scholar, so I practice what I study, I would now, 5 years later, probably say that the wish was indeed fulfilled, and it was not a small wish, which I will not undisclose here, but it was not a small wish. But in the realm of magic, verification is, of course, tricky business. So that was my example. And we move on to our fourth invited guest, who is Andrea Centore. Andrea Centore holds a master's degree in translation studies from the University of Mont-Hainaut in Belgium, and another master's degree in religious studies from the University of Amsterdam. His research explores the intersection of Jewish and Islamic esotericism through the perspectives of intellectual and global history, with a particular focus on Kabbalah, Sufism, and the science of letterism. In addition, Andrea has engaged with texts and practices from a wide range of esoteric traditions, including Islamic occultism, various strands of Western esotericism, and Nat Tantric yoga. I invited Andrea into this podcast because he is the co-founder and managing director of the Research Network for the Study of Esoteric Practices, acronymed as RENSEP, a charitable association which aims to foster a more systematic dialogue between the academic community and esoteric practitioners. Andrea is therefore in permanent contact with a large network of esoteric and magical practitioners. Andrea, welcome to Erlangen. And what is the example you want to bring to the discussion?
Thank you, Bernd. I would like to talk about the practice of Sufi lettrism, also known as Ilm al-Huruf, the science of letters. Sufi lettrism developed in the 12th century in the writings of figures like Ibn Arabi, known in the Sufi tradition as the greatest sheikh. In Sufi lettrism, just as in Jewish Kabbalah, the letters of the Arabic alphabet are conceptualized as cosmogonic symbols, forming the matrix of reality and serving as building blocks of the cosmos. In practice, letters are used as epistemological tools to decode the hidden truths of the cosmos, but also as sources of magical power. Moreover, they are used both as linguistic units and as numerals. The practice I would like to share originates in the writings of Ahmed al-Buni, a lettrist author who lived in North Africa in the 12th and 13th centuries, and who is known for his magical operationalization of the science of letters. Al-Buni has become popular in Arabic culture as an infamous sorcerer, and his books are considered dangerous objects, especially his Shams al-Ma'arif, the Sun of Knowledge, or the Sun of Gnosis. However, recent scholarship has aligned al-Buni more with the figure of a traditional Sufi sheikh rather than a sorcerer. In his practical system, magic squares play an important role. So magic squares, or awfaq in Arabic, are configurations of a set of consecutive numbers into a square grid, so that the sum of the numbers in each row, column, and diagonal is the same. A typical magical operation described by al-Buni involves a period of seclusion, fasting, and purification, as well as the recitation of prayers and divine names. After these preparations, the practitioner, following a precise astrological timing, must convert the numbers of the magic square into letters and inscribe them on a material support, generally a metal plate, while suffumigating it, for instance with mastic or white sandalwood. Once the operation is completed, the practitioner must wear the magic square, for instance as a ring, to obtain the desired outcome, such as an increase in wealth or protection against thieves. As I have mentioned, Albuni's writings have become widely popular in the contemporary Arabic world. However, the contemporary practice of Albuni's amuletic magic differs from the procedures described in the authentic Bunian corpus. An example of such adaptations can be found among modern practitioners, and I can mention a practitioner that I have encountered in Fez, Morocco, who used magic squares mainly for apotropaic purposes, so for protection, as well as for increasing one's wealth. In his practice, he replaced the preparatory practices involving seclusion, fasting, and purification with the visit of a Sufi zawiya. So a zawiya is a building which is usually built around the tomb of the founder of a Sufi order or a local saint, and where Sufi practices are done. So in this place, this practitioner engaged in dhikr, the practice of recitation of divine names with other Sufis, with the intent of canalizing the spiritual energy produced by the group of practitioners into his amulets. This is an interesting example of how the practice of lettrism has changed over time.
Thank you very much, Andrea. So we have 4 examples of magical practices on the table, also contemporary magical practices. I think the examples show that magic has many faces, but what holds everything together? Is magic a coherent category or thing after all? So I would like to begin the discussion by posing the meanest question of all to Marco Pasi. What is magic?
Yes, and this, in fact, is a very mean question because it's a question that has been debated by generations of scholars, and I think there is no no final question to this no final answer to this question. Even going back to the early modern period, one of the most famous magicians of the Renaissance, Giordano Bruno, in one of his works on magic, he wrote, how can we define magic? There are so many definitions of magic as there are magicians themselves. So it is interesting to see that this question was already considered to be an open-ended question without a clear answer even 500 years ago. And here we are today, and we are struggling again with this kind of question. I can give you the answer that I would give. So obviously, it's not meant to be the final answer, but I think it's just an operational answer. So it's a kind of idea that we can give, especially to people who are not involved in magic, who have not read so much about magic, whether scholarly literature or whether even texts that are meant for practitioners of magic. So just to give, I think, a very, very basic idea of what I think we are talking about when we talk about magic. So for me, magic, I would say, is a complex cultural tradition based on practices and beliefs that are supposed to be transformative. So in the sense that they should bring about a transformation of reality, understood in a very broad sense. And this should be done with the use of extraordinary and or unlawful means. What does this mean? So this is actually the crucial point. Extraordinary and or unlawful means. Obviously, this refers to a particular context because practices or ideas or beliefs that are supposed to be extraordinary in a particular context may not be so in another context. And the same goes, of course, for what is unlawful, what is licit, and what is illicit. So the fact that this is always contextualized, so it belongs to a particular context, I think is important because if we look at history, it is clear that magic emerged in a particular context. We go back to ancient Greece. This is the moment when the word was used for the very first time. And it was actually coming from Persia. So it was coming from another ethnic group, which was perceived to be a rival or even an enemy by ancient Greeks. So you see that at this moment, this word enters Greek culture, and it has from the very beginning a kind of exotic flavor. So it is coming from the other, from another space. And for a long time in ancient Greece, classic ancient Greece, magic was used as a term to identify the practices of other people. So practices that did not belong, for instance, to what was supposed to be the standard religious practices of the Greek city. Um, so there were specialists of the sacred, as we might call them today, who would go around, perform particular rituals like casting spells, helping people with problems of love, of money, and so on. And they were the magicians in this context, who did not necessarily have a particular place in ancient Greek society. So starting from that, you can see that there has been a continuity throughout Western culture that has identified magic as a problem, as something that is being done by people who are not behaving according to the standards of society. And at one point, of course, there were people who started to identify with magic, so who adopted also this terminology and this category and started to call themselves magicians. So this is the original context. And then, of course, it's a long history until we get to today. We don't have to cover it all.
Yes. So what you just outlined is that there are basically two main functions of the term magic. So that it throughout history, it has had an othering function. People were devalued, ostracized, criminalized by claiming that they practice magic, and this has a long history. There are three big stereotypes, namely that magic is inefficacious, that it's a-religious, and that it's antisocial. I think these are the three big stereotypes that characterize this, let's call it discourse of exclusion. But then we have seen there are, as our four examples show, there is the other side of the coin. So people have appropriated the term in a positive sense to denote their own practices and even to kind of turn around the stereotypes. So it's a kind of stereotype reversal. They think it's extremely efficacious. It's, of course, a legitimate thing. Some practitioners claim it's divinely ordained, and they claim that they might even help society through their work. So how do we explain this weird ambivalency in the term? Judith, what do you think?
How do we explain the ambivalency? There are so many concepts wrapped up in there, and of course, buried in Marco's history of magical practice, there is a huge amount of othering. So you mentioned Giordano Bruno, who was executed for I think not for his magical practices, but for a set of transgressive beliefs, heretical beliefs. Yeah. But at the same time, that what was happening in Europe was the witch craze, massively overestimated in terms of numbers. We know by 19th century scholars, but that was a classic process of othering. And the interesting thing you have to think about with the witch craze is how few of the people who were accused of practicing magic were actually doing it. You know, magic was used to have people judicially murdered. And I come from a place I live in a place in the southwest of the UK where the last recorded witch executions took place, and there had been an outbreak of anorexia amongst teenage girls in a small town in the aftermath of the English Civil War, where there was huge social unrest and poverty. And the obvious thing to do at that time was blame 3 socially excluded elderly women who were executed for witchcraft. So I think buried in that history, there's a really interesting double-edged thing going on. For sure, many practitioners of magic like to use the idea of transgression positively, and that's no bad thing. But at the same time, in many cultures around the world, we know there is still that stigmatization of the practitioner, and you can see that in contemporary Africa today in fairly horrific and lethal ways.
Yes.
So, yes, there is that ambivalence, and I think I know that Ronald Hutton noted recently about the practice of magic and witchcraft in the UK, that it's the unbelief in it by the state that allows magicians not to be persecuted. So I don't know if anyone else wants to talk about that.
That's part of secularization, absolutely.
Exactly.
That connects to secularization.
For sure.
Mm-hmm.
For sure.
It's a paradox.
Yes.
It's absolutely true.
There is an interesting historical connex between state law and magicians opening up. So I think Francis Barrett, around 1800, he published The Magus, and it's shortly after the anti-magical legislation shifted from an understanding of magic as heresy to an understanding of magic as fraud. So it's not a crime against God anymore, but now it's a crime against reason, which is not so severe, we could say. And at that moment, we actually start having author magicians. So more and more practitioners publishing with their real names and also starting advertisements and so on. I think there is an interesting connection between this.
But then there's in succession to that law, certainly in Britain, sees magic as fraudulent and prosecutes people for taking money off people, for gullible people. But it's the repeal of that legislation in 1951 that enables Gerald Bruce O'Gardner to be open about Wicca and, start the tide of pagan witchcraft flowing. He's very specific about that. So, in some ways is a demonstration. I think that on a popular level, amongst people at large, I don't think the secularization really happened.
No.
Not that much. And you can, people have traced that through the history of the 19th and 20th centuries. We spoke a little earlier today about Owen Davies, whose work on that is really interesting. So that secularization for me seems to be a very lovely official state and academic function. But you ask the ladies on the Barbican in Plymouth who go to gypsy seances on a Friday night, and they're quite clear. The magic has never really gone away, nor has their belief in it.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and we will discuss it later.